Elvis was very shy when I first met him. When I first met him,
was it Sun Studio? Where was it?
Sun Studio in Memphis there.
Nobody alive was better positioned to answer the question that has followed Elvis Presley for 70 years. Did he steal black music, or did he honor it? B.B. King knew Elvis before the fame existed. He watched him walk into segregated spaces nobody expected a white superstar to enter. He sat beside him in Las Vegas hotel rooms, singing blues songs nobody ever recorded. Now, the king of the blues delivers his verdict, and it is not what most people expect to hear. Let's check it out. The boy at Sun Studios nobody noticed yet. Sometime in the early 1950s, a young man walked into Sam Phillips's recording studio in Memphis, Tennessee. He was handsome, quiet, and polite in the particular way that makes an immediate impression on people accustomed to being ignored by strangers. He called everyone sir. He kept to himself mostly, practicing or simply listening, rarely saying more than necessary. Riley B. King, who the world already knew as B.B. King, noticed him, not because he recognized anything remarkable in the young man's playing or singing at that point, simply because the young man's manner stood out. Specifically his ease and comfort around the black musicians who regularly moved through Sun Studios during this period. This detail mattered enormously in Memphis in the early 1950s. The city operated under full segregation, with separate facilities, separate spaces, and carefully maintained social boundaries between black and white residents that governed nearly every aspect of daily life. Sun Studios itself represented one of the relatively rare spaces where these boundaries blurred somewhat, a recording environment where the music itself created a kind of neutral territory that the city's formal racial architecture had not fully penetrated. Within this context, a young white man's genuine ease and comfort around black musicians was not simply a pleasant social quality. It was, in 1952 or 1953 Memphis, a meaningful, observable departure from the default behavior of most white people in similar situations, who might be polite enough by surface standard while still carrying the subtle discomfort and social distance that segregation both produced and reinforced. King later described his first impressions of this young man with notable specificity, the kind of specific detail that suggests a genuine, lasting memory rather than a retroactively constructed one. He described him as handsome and quiet, polite to a fault. He specifically noted that the young man always called him sir, a form of address that, in the racial context of 1950s Memphis, carried its own particular significance. A young white man addressing a black man as sir represented, in that specific time and place, a conscious or at least instinctive rejection of the social hierarchy that segregation enforced as rigorously in daily language as in physical spaces. King also acknowledged, with characteristic honesty, that he did not initially recognize anything extraordinary in the young man's musical potential. He was okay, King later said of this early impression, but nothing about his playing or singing at that point revealed the transformation about to occur. This candid admission matters specifically because it distinguishes King's eventual assessment of Presley from simple hero worship or retroactive admiration shaped entirely by hindsight. King was not describing someone who had immediately obviously impressed him. He was describing someone who had grown into something extraordinary across the following years, a trajectory King watched closely and evaluated carefully rather than simply accepting because the broader world had decided it. The young man's name, of course, was Elvis Presley. He had not yet made his first commercial recording. He had not yet walked into Sam Phillips's studio to cut a song for his mother's birthday. He had not yet experienced the moment that would transform his life. Dewey Phillips playing "That's All Right Mama" on radio station WHBQ in July of 1954, then fielding phone calls from listeners desperate to know who this singer was, many of them assuming from the sound alone that he must be black. B.B. King was present for this entire early period, working within the same musical ecosystem that nurtured Presley's earliest development. King had begun recording at Sun Studios in 1951, several years before Presley's own first recordings, establishing himself within the Memphis music scene as a genuine, working professional, while Presley was still finding his way toward whatever sound would eventually define him. This proximity matters significantly to understanding the specific weight B.B. King's later assessments of Presley carry. He was not an outside observer, commenting on Presley's relationship with black music and black culture from a comfortable distance. He was an insider, present within the same physical spaces, working within the same creative environment during the precise period when Presley was absorbing the musical influences that would eventually reshape American popular culture. King's own musical background made him specifically qualified to evaluate what Presley was doing with those influences. He had grown up surrounded by the same gospel and blues traditions that shaped Presley's earliest musical instincts. Born in Itta, Mississippi, only about 100 miles from Presley's own birthplace in Tupelo, both men had absorbed the musical culture of rural Mississippi poverty during their childhoods, though the specific textures of their individual experiences differed considerably along the racial lines that defined everything about Southern life during this period. By the early 1950s, King had already developed his own distinctive guitar voice, the vibrato technique and bending style that would eventually make him one of the most influential guitarists in the history of American music. He was, by any measure, a genuine expert in exactly the musical tradition that Presley was beginning to absorb and transform into something new. His initial assessment that Presley was okay but nothing special followed eventually by a complete reassessment as Presley's actual sound and presence developed, tracks precisely the arc of a genuine, honest observer, evaluating a genuine, ongoing artistic development, rather than constructing a flattering retrospective narrative shaped entirely by eventual fame. What King eventually saw, once Presley's sound fully developed, would permanently revise his initial unimpressed assessment and establish the foundation for a friendship and mutual respect that would last in its own particular form for the remainder of both men's lives. The night Elvis walked into the wrong room. On purpose, December of 1956 at Memphis, Tennessee, Ellis Auditorium hosted the annual WDIA Goodwill Review, a fundraising concert organized by WDIA Radio, the groundbreaking Black-owned and Black-operated station that had become one of the most significant cultural institutions in Memphis's African-American community. The money raised that evening went specifically toward children in need within the city's Black community. By December of 1956, Elvis Presley was the most famous entertainer in America. Heartbreak Hotel had become, earlier that year, the first record in Billboard history to achieve what journalists described as a double-triple crown, topping multiple charts simultaneously in a way nobody had managed before. He was a millionaire. He was recognized everywhere he went. His face appeared on magazine covers across the country. His records sold in numbers that made industry veterans struggle for adequate comparisons. He attended the WDIA Goodwill Review anyway. B.B. King was there that night, performing as part of the evening's lineup of major Black artists from across Memphis and the broader region. He watched Elvis arrive. He watched the reaction from the crowd, the particular charged reaction of a Black audience in 1956. Memphis encountering the most famous white entertainer alive, walking into a space that the city's formal racial architecture designated as not his to occupy. This moment requires some historical context to understand fully. Memphis, in December of 1956, operated under comprehensive racial segregation, enforced by law and social custom with equal rigor. Spaces designated for Black events and Black audiences were, by the explicit logic of the segregation system, not spaces white people entered casually or without consequence. A white person attending a Black event, particularly a white person of Presley's extraordinary visibility and cultural significance, represented a deliberate, observable, consequential departure from the rules that governed nearly every other aspect of public life in that city at that time. Presley had already demonstrated this same willingness earlier that same year. In June of 1956, he had attended what was known as Colored Night at Memphis's local fairgrounds amusement park, deliberately ignoring the city's segregation ordinances to attend an event designated exclusively for Black residents. This earlier incident had drawn criticism from some quarters, though it received considerably less public attention than a similar gesture from the most famous entertainer in America might have attracted even a decade later, when the civil rights movement had raised the broader public's awareness of exactly what such gestures meant within the context of Southern segregation. The December WDIA event carried even greater symbolic weight, specifically because of its public, organized nature. This was not a private gathering or a casual personal visit. This was a formal, publicly advertised fundraising event, hosted by one of the most significant Black cultural institutions in Memphis, attended by the city's Black community, specifically as a community gathering, raising money for children who needed help within that same community. Elvis Presley showed up. B.B. King watched him walk in. King's own account of this moment, shared across subsequent decades of interviews and his autobiography, describes the specific atmosphere with considerable honesty. The entire Black community had turned out that evening, he explained, the DJs performing skits and presenting music to a full house. When Presley appeared, the reaction was unmistakable. This was, King emphasized, the 1950s. And for a young white man at the absolute peak of his fame, to show up at an all-Black function took genuine courage. This assessment, coming specifically from King, carries weight that a similar observation from almost any other witness might not. He was not a sympathetic outsider trying to rehabilitate Presley's reputation. He was a Black man who had grown up under Mississippi segregation, who understood exactly what the social and cultural rules of that system demanded, and who had personally watched Presley disregard those rules by walking through those doors. King's interpretation of Presley's motivation, offered with the same characteristic directness that defined his broader reflections on their relationship, was straightforward. He believed Presley was showing his roots and seemed proud of those roots. This framing, showing roots rather than making a political statement or performing a calculated gesture of racial solidarity, matches everything else known about how Presley typically operated during this period. He rarely made explicit public statements about race or segregation. He simply moved through the world in ways that reflected whatever genuine internal compass he had developed during his own Mississippi childhood, absorbing the music and culture of Black Memphis without apparently experiencing the social anxiety around racial boundaries that defined most white Southerners of his generation and background. RCA's contract with Presley reportedly prevented him from actually performing at the WDIA event that evening. He had apparently agreed immediately when approached about participating more actively, but contractual restrictions made that impossible. Instead, he attended, watched, supported the event with his presence, and reportedly came onto the stage briefly at the event's conclusion, generating the kind of crowd reaction his presence always produced before being escorted out. For B.B. King, watching this unfold from his own position as a performer that evening, the night confirmed something he had already begun forming as an impression during their earlier encounters at Sun Studios. Presley's relationship to Black music and Black culture was not the relationship of someone exploiting something external to himself. It was the relationship of someone who had genuinely absorbed those traditions as part of his own identity, who moved toward rather than away from the communities those traditions came from, even when doing so carried real social cost in 1956 Memphis. This distinction between exploiting a tradition from outside it and genuinely absorbing it as part of one's own formation would become central to everything King said publicly about Presley across the following decades, particularly as the accusation of cultural theft became increasingly central to how younger generations debated Presley's legacy and its relationship to the Black musicians who had shaped him. Did Elvis steal Black music? No question has followed Elvis Presley's legacy more persistently than this one. Across decades of cultural debate, academic analysis, and increasingly heated social media argument, the accusation that Presley built his career by taking Black music, profiting from it enormously while the Black artists who created it remained largely uncredited and unrewarded, has become one of the defining controversies surrounding his name. B.B. King addressed this question directly, repeatedly, and with the kind of unambiguous clarity that left very little room for misinterpretation. His answer, grounded in personal proximity to exactly the musical world at the center of this debate, deserves considerably more attention than it has typically received within popular discussions of Presley's cultural legacy. In his 1996 autobiography, Blues All Around Me, King wrote plainly that Elvis did not steal any music from anyone. He just had his own interpretation of the music he had grown up on, King wrote, adding that this was true for everyone who absorbed musical influences and transformed them into something personal and new. He concluded with a statement that, coming from one of the most respected figures in the entire history of American blues, carries genuine weight. He thought Elvis had integrity. This assessment did not arrive naively or without King's own complex feelings about how the music business had treated black artists throughout the same period when Presley was rising to extraordinary fame. King understood, from personal experience within that same industry, exactly how the commercial structures surrounding popular music in the 1950s systematically disadvantaged black artists while enabling white performers covering similar material to reach far larger audiences and accumulate far greater financial rewards. He addressed this dimension of the broader debate with characteristic honesty in his PBS American Roots Music oral history interview, noting that he had wondered why the same musical content, performed by black artists, was labeled race records and therefore categorized separately from mainstream pop, while similar material performed by white artists became rock and roll and achieved mainstream commercial distribution. "The only reason I could see was because they were white," King said directly, a statement that acknowledged the genuine, systemic racial inequality embedded in the music industry's commercial structures during this period, without attributing personal racist intent to any individual performer operating within those structures. This distinction between systemic commercial inequality and individual moral character is essential to understanding King's complete position on the question of whether Presley stole black music. He never denied that the music industry had operated in ways that systematically disadvantaged black artists during this period. He never denied that Presley achieved commercial rewards that comparable black artists performing similar material were denied by those same commercial structures. What he consistently and specifically rejected was the conclusion that Presley himself was personally responsible for this systemic inequality, or that his engagement with black musical traditions represented theft rather than genuine absorption and transformation. King's autobiography articulated the specific philosophical principle underlying this position with considerable clarity. "Music is owned by the whole universe," King wrote. "It is not exclusive to the black man or the white man or any other color. This framing does not erase the historical reality of how musical traditions develop within specific communities and carry specific cultural meaning for those communities. It does, however, assert a position about how genuine musical influence actually works, how a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, absorbing gospel and blues as a fundamental part of his own formation, cannot be said to have stolen something that had already become inseparable from his own musical identity long before he ever entered a recording studio." King also addressed directly one of the specific accusations that circulated most persistently in certain discussions of Presley's racial legacy: the question of whether Presley had explicitly expressed disrespect toward black audiences or black artists. A widely circulated false quote attributed to Presley suggested he had said, "Black people could only shine his shoes and buy his music," a statement that, if accurate, would represent an explicit expression of contempt, directly contradicting everything King had personally observed about Presley's actual behavior around black musicians and black audiences. King rejected this characterization completely and without qualification. His own direct, personal experience of Presley's behavior, accumulated across years of interaction, beginning at Sun Studios in the early 1950s and continuing through encounters in Las Vegas during the 1970s, produced a consistent picture that bore no resemblance to the image that false quote tried to establish. The man King knew was the same man who had called him Sir at Sun Studios, when both of them were still finding their footing, the same man who had walked into Ellis Auditorium for the WDIA Goodwill Review in December of 1956, the same man who would later sit beside King in Las Vegas hotel rooms singing blues songs simply because he loved the music and loved the company. Beyond his personal testimony, King also spoke to the broader question of Presley's actual contribution to the musical landscape that black artists inhabited. "He opened many doors," King said in his 2010 San Antonio interview. "By all his actions, not just his words, he showed his love for all people." He acknowledged that when Presley's recording of "That's All Right Mama" first played on Memphis radio in July of 1954, the response from listeners, many of whom assumed from the sound alone that the singer must be black, demonstrated something genuinely significant about what Presley had accomplished musically. It was not just country. It was rhythm and blues. It was pop music. It was music for everybody. This framing, music for everybody, represents King's most concise articulation of what he believed Presley had actually achieved with the black musical traditions that shaped him. Not theft, not exploitation. A genuine transformation of shared influences into something new that, whatever its complicated commercial implications, expanded rather than diminished the reach and recognition of the musical world it drew from. The racism accusation, and the man who knew better. Of all the accusations that have attached themselves to Elvis Presley's legacy across the decades since his death, the claim that he was personally racist has proven among the most persistent and most damaging. It circulated quietly for years before finding significant new momentum in an era of social media where unverified claims spread faster than corrections can follow them. B.B. King addressed this accusation with the same directness he had applied to the stolen music debate, but with an additional layer of personal conviction rooted in something specific and irreplaceable. He had actually been there. He had known Presley personally, beginning before the fame existed, continuing through the height of it, and into the final decade of Presley's life. His testimony represented not opinion or inference, but direct, accumulated personal experience spanning roughly 25 years. In his 2010 interview conducted in San Antonio, Texas, King delivered what he called the definitive truth about Elvis Presley and racism. With Elvis, there was not a single drop of racism in that man, King said. And when I say that, believe me, I should know. This particular framing, believe me, I should know, carries specific weight that deserves careful attention. King was not simply asserting a general character judgment about someone he admired from a distance. He was explicitly invoking his own particular position as a black man who had interacted directly and personally with Presley across multiple decades, in contexts ranging from the racially charged environment of early 1950s Memphis through the considerably more integrated, though still complicated social world of 1970s Las Vegas. He had observed Presley in exactly the kinds of situations where genuine racist attitudes, however carefully managed in more public settings, typically surface in private behavior. What King had observed consistently and across this entire span of personal interaction bore no resemblance to the portrait that the racism accusation tried to establish. He went further still in the same 2010 interview, offering a statement that left no ambiguity about his overall assessment. If anyone says Elvis Presley was a racist, King said, then they do not know a thing about Elvis Presley or music history. This is a remarkable statement from a man of King's stature, background, and personal history within the racially structured world of American popular music during the 1950s and beyond. He was not a naive observer, unfamiliar with racism's actual texture and operation. He had experienced racial segregation directly and personally throughout his own childhood in Mississippi and his early career in Memphis. He knew precisely what racism looked like in practice, having navigated its specific demands and limitations throughout the most formative decades of his own life and career. The false quote that drove much of the racism accusation against Presley, the claimed statement that black people could only shine his shoes and buy his music, had been thoroughly investigated and debunked by the time King addressed the question publicly in 2010. Jet magazine had traced the alleged quote as far back as 1957, reporting that attempts to verify where, when, and to whom Presley supposedly made this statement had proven consistently unsuccessful. No credible witness, no verified record, no documented source ever materialized to support it, and multiple people who knew Presley personally during the period when the quote was allegedly made consistently denied he had ever said anything resembling it. Presley himself had addressed racial questions with characteristic directness on occasions throughout his career, crediting specific black artists as formative influences rather than obscuring those connections. In Tupelo, Mississippi, I used to hear old Arthur Crudup bang his box the way I do now, he told an interviewer, referring to the blues musician whose recorded material had shaped some of Presley's earliest musical instincts. He expressed similar direct acknowledgement regarding other specific black artists whose work had formed him musically, in a pattern that, while it did not resolve every complex question about credit and commercial reward, reflected someone who maintained genuine awareness of and appreciation for where his music had come from. King pointed specifically to this pattern of genuine acknowledgement and continued personal connection as evidence against the racism accusation. People today will say things about Elvis they just don't know about, King observed in his 2010 interview. His observation that Presley opened many doors and showed his love for all people by his actions, rather than simply his words, directly addressed the most sophisticated version of the racism accusation, the version that conceded Presley might not have expressed explicit racial contempt, while still arguing that his actions, specifically his commercial exploitation of black musical traditions, demonstrated a kind of structural racism regardless of personal attitudes. King rejected this framing, not by denying the systemic inequalities of the music industry during this period, which he had addressed directly and honestly elsewhere, but by insisting on the distinction between those systemic realities and Presley's individual character and conduct. A man who called black musicians Sir at Sun Studios before anyone knew his name. A man who walked into Ellis Auditorium for a black charity event at the height of his fame. A man who, decades later, would sit quietly in hotel rooms in Las Vegas, singing blues songs with King, simply because he loved the music and the company. These specific documented behaviors, accumulated across roughly 25 years of personal interaction witnessed directly by one of the most credible possible observers, formed the actual evidentiary basis for King's definitive rejection of the racism accusation. Not sentiment, not celebrity loyalty. Not the kind of generous, protective assessment that sometimes emerges from people speaking carefully about famous friends after their deaths. Simply what B.B. King had actually seen across decades of direct personal experience that contradicted everything the accusation claimed about a man he had known since before the world knew his name. Two Kings. In Las Vegas. By the 1970s, both Elvis Presley and B.B. King had found themselves through entirely different paths, spending considerable time in Las Vegas. Presley had established his famous residency at the International Hotel, later renamed the Hilton, beginning in 1969, performing multiple extended runs each year that drew enormous devoted crowds from across the country and around the world. King had built his own Las Vegas presence through a different route, performing in the hotel lounges and smaller venues that existed alongside the main showrooms where headliners like Presley commanded the largest audiences and the largest fees. This difference in venue scale reflected the continuing commercial disparity between what the industry offered its black and white stars, even by the 1970s, even after decades of civil rights progress had formally dismantled the legal architecture of segregation that had governed both men's earliest years in Memphis. Presley filled the main showrooms. King performed in lounges. The music business had changed considerably since 1951. It had not changed entirely, yet within the specific relatively closed world of Las Vegas's entertainment community during this period, these differences in commercial scale created less social distance than they might have elsewhere. The hotels housed everyone, performers of every stature, in close physical proximity. Backstage areas, hotel corridors, and private rooms connected people across the commercial hierarchies that governed their public-facing careers, creating opportunities for the kind of informal, private interaction that the formal structures of the music industry rarely facilitated. It was within this Las Vegas environment that the friendship between Presley and King developed its most sustained, most private, and in many ways most revealing chapter. According to accounts that have emerged across various interviews and biographical sources, Presley reportedly played a direct role in helping King secure a more prominent performance opportunity in Las Vegas during this period, using his own considerable influence within the Las Vegas entertainment world to advocate for his friend in a way that reflects the same pattern of genuine action-based support that King had pointed to throughout his broader reflections on Presley's character. This detail matters considerably within the broader context of King's assessment of Presley. He had argued, consistently and directly, that Presley showed his love for all people through his actions rather than simply his words, that the test of genuine character lay in what someone actually did rather than what they said in public settings, shaped by commercial and social pressures. An instance of Presley quietly using his own influence to support King's career within the specific commercially stratified world of Las Vegas entertainment represents exactly the kind of action-based evidence King consistently invoked when defending Presley against accusations that his engagement with black music and black artists was fundamentally extractive rather than genuinely reciprocal. Beyond this specific instance of professional support, the two men developed a private social connection during these Las Vegas years that offers perhaps the most intimate available glimpse into the actual texture of their friendship. According to accounts from people connected to both men during this period, Presley and King would sometimes spend evenings together after their respective performances had concluded, sitting privately in hotel rooms and simply singing blues songs together, unrecorded and unperformed for any audience. This detail carries particular significance specifically because of what it reveals about Presley's genuine relationship to the musical tradition at the center of so much public debate about his legacy. A man performing purely for commercial reasons, exploiting black music as a marketable sound without genuine personal connection to its traditions and roots, does not spend his evenings voluntarily singing blues with B.B. King after the paying audiences have gone home. That specific, private, unrecorded activity reflects something more fundamental than commercial calculation or strategic image management. It reflects genuine love for a musical tradition pursued privately and without audience precisely because it needed no audience to feel worthwhile. King's own reflections on these Las Vegas interactions consistently returned to the same quality he had first noticed about the young Presley at Sun Studios in the early 1950s: comfort and ease. The absence of the social distance or performative effort that often characterizes interactions across the racial boundaries that both men had spent their entire lives navigating in very different ways. Presley did not, in King's consistent accounts across multiple decades of reflection, behave like someone performing racial openness for an audience. He behaved like someone for whom that openness was simply natural, rooted in whatever genuine formation had occurred during his Mississippi childhood and his Memphis years before fame arrived. The Las Vegas period also offered King the opportunity to observe Presley at a point in his life and career when the pressures of sustained, extraordinary fame had already taken visible, significant toll. By the mid-1970s, the physical and emotional strain, documented extensively elsewhere in Presley's story, had become increasingly apparent to people who encountered him in person. King, observing from the specific vantage point of someone who had known him across multiple decades, would have been particularly well positioned to notice and evaluate the distance between the young man he had first encountered at Sun Studios and the increasingly burdened figure navigating his final years. This longer view, spanning from the early 1950s through the mid-1970s, gives King's complete assessment of Presley a depth and specificity that shorter acquaintances or more distant observers simply cannot match. He was not evaluating a public persona constructed by a publicity machine. He was reflecting on a person he had watched develop, struggle, succeed, and eventually decline across a span of roughly 25 years of direct personal interaction, from two young musicians finding their footing in Memphis to two established legends navigating the particular complications of sustained fame in very different registers. What King saw across that entire arc consistently informed the definitive assessments he would eventually offer publicly, assessments that carried the specific, irreplaceable weight of someone who had been present, watching, and evaluating honestly the entire time. Why his voice still matters. B.B. King died in May of 2015 at the age of 89 in Las Vegas, the same city where he had spent those private evenings singing blues songs with Elvis Presley decades earlier. He left behind one of the most significant bodies of work in the entire history of American music, along with a specific, detailed, and repeatedly stated public record regarding his personal knowledge of and friendship with the man the world called the King of Rock and Roll. His assessments of Presley accumulated across his 1996 autobiography, his Charlie Rose interview, his PBS oral history contribution, and his 2010 San Antonio conversation represent something considerably more valuable than typical celebrity tribute or posthumous loyalty. They represent the considered, honest, sometimes complicated reflections of someone who had known Presley personally across roughly 25 years, who had observed him in the specific racially charged environment of 1950s Memphis, where everything about Presley's relationship to black music and black culture first took shape, and who had continued observing him across the following decades with the kind of honest, evaluative attention that genuine friendship combined with genuine professional expertise makes possible. What makes King's voice specifically significant in the ongoing debate about Presley's legacy is not simply that he knew Presley personally. Many people knew Presley personally. What makes King's voice uniquely significant is the combination of personal proximity with genuine, first-hand expertise in exactly the musical tradition at the center of every serious debate about Presley's cultural meaning and moral legacy. King was not an outsider, commenting on a tradition he knew only from a distance. He was one of the central figures within that tradition, someone whose own artistic contributions had helped define the very music that Presley absorbed, transformed, and brought to the largest audience any popular musician had ever reached. His verdict, delivered across multiple decades and multiple formats, was consistent and unambiguous. Elvis Presley did not steal black music. He absorbed it genuinely, transformed it personally, and maintained a consistent, action-based respect for the communities and traditions it came from across his entire career. The racism accusation was, by King's direct and repeated testimony, simply wrong, contradicted by everything he had personally witnessed across 25 years of direct interaction. This verdict has not fully penetrated the popular debate surrounding Presley's legacy, particularly among younger audiences who encounter the accusation of cultural theft through social media discussions that rarely include King's detailed, contradictory testimony. The false quote claiming Presley expressed contempt for black audiences continues circulating widely despite having been thoroughly debunked, while King's own clear, documented statements receive considerably less attention and distribution within the same discussions. This asymmetry reflects something significant about how historical reputation actually operates in contemporary media environments. Accusations travel faster than corrections. Simple, emotionally charged narratives spread more easily than complicated, contextually grounded ones. A false quote attributing racial contempt to a dead celebrity fits neatly into 140 characters. B.B. King's nuanced, experience-based defense of Presley's actual character, grounded in decades of personal observation and genuine musical expertise, requires considerably more space and context to communicate fully. What King's account ultimately demands, from anyone willing to engage seriously with the question of Elvis Presley's actual relationship to black music and black culture, is exactly the kind of careful, contextually grounded attention that both men's lives and careers genuinely deserve. Neither simple hero worship nor simple condemnation does justice to the actual historical record, which is, as King consistently suggested, considerably more complicated and considerably more human than either extreme allows. Presley was a white man from Mississippi who grew up absorbing black music in the specific, historically particular environment of 1940s and 50s. Memphis, who entered a commercial music industry structured in ways that systematically advantage white artists over black ones, who achieved rewards within that system that comparable black artists were denied, and who simultaneously maintained, by the consistent testimony of people who knew him directly, a genuine, personal, action-based respect for the communities and traditions that had shaped him. Both parts of that description are true simultaneously. King never denied either part. What he consistently insisted on was that the second part, the genuine personal respect and authentic musical connection, mattered enormously to understanding Presley accurately, and that dismissing or ignoring it in favor of a simpler, more condemnatory narrative did no justice to the actual historical truth of who Presley was and how he actually moved through the racially complicated world he inhabited. This insistence, coming from B.B. King specifically, carries moral weight that demands serious engagement rather than casual dismissal. He earned the right to speak about this particular question through 25 years of direct personal experience, through his own lifetime of navigating the same racial structures that shaped Presley's story from outside rather than inside them, and through his unimpeachable standing as one of the genuine masters of exactly the musical tradition at the center of every serious debate about Presley's legacy. His voice has not yet changed how most fans see Elvis Presley. It should. B.B. King knew Elvis before the world did. He watched him navigate race, music, and fame across 25 years. His verdict was clear, consistent, and grounded in personal experience nobody else could match. If this story shifted how you see either man, subscribe for more honest accounts from the people who were actually there.